Service accounts are one of those ideas that sound simple at first and then quietly become a major source of security risk if you treat them like background noise. In this lesson, we're going to get comfortable with what a service account really is, why it exists, and why it deserves more careful handling than many human logins. A service account is not a special kind of magic user. It is still an identity, and identities exist to be trusted with actions. The difference is that the actions are performed by software, automation, or a system component rather than a person typing a password. That difference changes the ways things can go wrong, because software does not get tired, does not notice something suspicious, and does not stop itself when a task starts behaving oddly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A good starting point is to separate purpose from habit, because many environments end up with service accounts simply because that is how it has always been done. A service account is an identity created for a non-human actor, like an application that needs to read a database, a scheduled job that needs to copy files, or an automated workflow that needs to call an API. When you hear API for the first time, think Application Programming Interface, API, which is just a formal way for software to ask another service to do something. The key idea is that the software needs proof it is allowed to do that thing, so it authenticates as an identity. If you do not plan for that identity carefully, you end up with an always-on set of keys that can do too much. And attackers love those because they are quiet, powerful, and often ignored. The first major principle is strict scope, which is really just least privilege applied with discipline. Scope means defining exactly what the service account can do and where it can do it, instead of giving it broad permission because it is convenient. Beginners often assume that if an application needs access, it probably needs a lot of access, but most real tasks are narrow when you describe them in plain language. If a job only needs to read a specific storage location, then write access is unnecessary, and access to other locations is unnecessary too. If an application only needs to fetch a list of records, then permission to delete records is a risk, not a feature. Strict scope turns identity into a precise tool rather than a master key, and it makes mistakes smaller when something goes wrong. To make strict scope real, you have to think in terms of actions, resources, and boundaries. Actions are the verbs, like read, write, create, delete, or administer. Resources are the nouns, like a database table, a storage bucket, a messaging queue, or an identity directory. Boundaries are the fences that keep the account from wandering, like limiting it to a specific environment, a specific project, or a specific application role. When you combine these three, you get a permission shape that matches the job instead of the organization chart. This matters because attackers do not need your entire environment. They only need one foothold with enough rights to expand. Every extra permission is a possible stepping stone, and strict scope removes stones from the path. A common misconception is that service accounts must be highly privileged because they support important systems, and important systems supposedly require broad authority. In reality, importance is an argument for tighter control, not looser control, because the blast radius is larger. Another misconception is that service accounts are safer than human accounts because they are not used for interactive logins, but attackers do not care whether an identity is used interactively if they can use its credentials programmatically. In fact, non-interactive use can make detection harder because the activity looks like normal automation. The safest mental model is to treat a service account as a powerful robot badge that can be stolen, copied, and used at machine speed. That model pushes you toward limiting what the badge can do and limiting how long it stays valid. The second major principle is limited lifetime, which means credentials should not live forever just because the software wants stability. When credentials never expire, they tend to leak and remain useful long after anyone remembers they exist. Leaks happen through copied configuration files, forgotten scripts, build logs, screenshots, old backups, or even accidental commits to source repositories. A long-lived secret is a long-lived opportunity. Limited lifetime turns credential theft into a race against time instead of a permanent compromise. Even if an attacker gets the credential, it becomes worthless sooner, which is a huge reduction in risk, especially for identities that operate quietly in the background. Limited lifetime can take different shapes, but the idea stays the same. Reduce how long a credential can be used without being refreshed. Sometimes the credential is an access token that naturally expires quickly and must be reissued. Sometimes it is a key that is rotated on a schedule, meaning it is replaced and the old one is invalidated. Sometimes it is a short-lived certificate. You do not need to memorize the mechanics here. You need to internalize the strategy that software should adapt to expiring credentials rather than security adapting to software convenience. If an application breaks when a credential expires, that is not proof the credential should last forever. It is proof the application needs a safer way to receive and renew its identity. There is also a subtle but important link between limited lifetime and incident response. If you suspect a service account has been compromised, you want the ability to shut down access quickly without taking down the business. Short-lived tokens naturally reduce the window of exposure, and well-managed rotation gives you a practiced process for changing secrets without panic. When rotation is normal, rotation during an emergency is less likely to cause outages. Beginners sometimes fear rotation because they imagine everything will crash, but the real danger is avoiding rotation until you are forced to do it under pressure. Limited lifetime is like practicing fire drills because it transforms a rare crisis action into a routine, controlled operation. The third principle is clear ownership, and this is where many organizations stumble because service accounts often feel like they belong to nobody. Ownership means a specific person or team is responsible for why the account exists, what it can do, how it is maintained, and what should happen if something looks wrong. Without ownership, accounts linger forever, permissions accumulate, and no one feels empowered to tighten scope or retire the identity. Clear ownership also means there is a human decision-maker who can answer simple but critical questions, like what workflow depends on this identity and what change window is safe for rotation. When you tie a service account to a real owner, you create accountability and a path for safe change. Ownership should include lifecycle thinking, creation, use, review, and retirement. Creation is not just clicking a button. It is recording why the account exists and what it is allowed to do. Use is not just running the application. It is ensuring the account is used only by the intended system in the intended context. Review is checking periodically that the permissions still match the job, because jobs change over time even when names stay the same. Retirement is disabling and removing the account when it is no longer needed, which is often forgotten because nothing breaks immediately when an unused identity remains. Each of these stages becomes much easier when an owner is assigned, because someone has the authority to say yes, no, and not anymore. Strict scope and limited lifetime reduce damage, but monitoring completes the picture because you cannot protect what you never notice. Service accounts should produce activity that is predictable because automation tends to be consistent. That predictability is useful because unusual behavior stands out, like a service account suddenly accessing resources it never touched before, making calls at strange times, or attempting administrative actions that do not fit its role. Monitoring is not about spying. It is about validating that the robot is doing the job it was built to do. When monitoring is designed around expected behavior, it becomes a powerful early warning system for both attacks and misconfigurations. A compromised service account often starts behaving differently, and the earlier you notice, the smaller the incident becomes. Another way to tighten the story is to reduce where the service account can be used, not just what it can do. Even if an attacker steals credentials, it helps if those credentials only work from a specific environment or from specific systems. Think of it like a key that only opens a door if you are standing inside the building, not outside on the street. This can be done by binding identity used to workload identity, to trusted devices, or to known network paths, depending on the environment. The beginner takeaway is that credentials should not be universally usable from anywhere on the internet if the workload itself lives in a controlled place. Limiting where an identity can be used is another way of shrinking blast radius. You also want to avoid mixing human and service identities because it creates confusion and weakens investigation. If a person logs in using a service account, you lose the ability to tie actions to a human owner and you normalize a practice that makes credential sharing more likely. Conversely, if a service uses a human account, it is more likely to break when that person changes roles, changes passwords, or leaves the organization, and it tends to inherit broad permissions that were meant for a person. Clean separation makes auditing clearer and decisions easier because the identity's purpose is visible in its behavior. When an identity has one purpose and one style of use, security controls become more effective and troubleshooting becomes less chaotic. As you build an environment with many service accounts, sprawl becomes its own risk, even if each account is individually well-designed. Sprawl happens when teams create new service accounts for every small project, forget to delete them, and leave permissions behind like old keys in a drawer. The solution is not to ban service accounts, because automation still needs identities, but to treat service accounts as managed assets with inventory and review. An inventory means you can answer how many exist, which systems use them, and which ones are inactive. Review means you can spot accounts that have not been used in months, accounts with unusual permissions, or accounts that lack a clear owner. When you can see the whole set, you can keep it clean, and cleanliness is a security feature. An important mindset shift for beginners is to stop thinking of service accounts as a technical detail and start thinking of them as risk-bearing business enablers. They exist to let systems do useful work, and that work is part of delivering products and services. Because they enable important workflows, they deserve a design approach that balances reliability and security. Strict scope helps reliability too, because when permissions are tight, failures tend to be clear and localized rather than mysterious and widespread. Limited lifetime encourages healthier engineering practices that make systems resilient to routine change. Clear ownership prevents the slow decay of access control over time. When you connect these ideas, service account security stops being a rule and starts being a way to keep automation safe and dependable. To close this out, it helps to summarize the story in a way that sticks without turning into a checklist. Service accounts are non-human identities used by software, and that makes them attractive targets because they often run quietly with meaningful access. Strict scope keeps permissions aligned to real tasks, so the identity cannot do more than it should. Limited lifetime makes stolen credentials less valuable by shrinking the window in which they work, and it encourages routine rotation that reduces emergency chaos. Clear ownership prevents orphaned identities and ensures someone can review, tighten, and retire access as systems evolve. When those three ideas work together, service accounts become controlled tools instead of invisible master keys, and your cloud environment stays safer by design rather than safer by hope.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit BareMetalCyber.com.